So, yeah, so as Sundari said, I am a faculty here at the Department of Biomedical Engineering at IIT Hyderabad. I head the neurotech lab here, so we work on a lot of neurotechnological aspects, basically looking at application of engineering concepts towards either diagnostics or rehabilitation or adjuvant therapy. For now, so we were going to start with a stroke related study, but due to COVID, we have put a stop on that. We typically work with patient cohorts, but clinical studies are going to be very difficult in this scenario. So, so then what we did was we reverted back to our previous data set. So one of it is actually on Parkinson's disease patients who have been implanted with deep brain stimulation. So this talk will not be more of a biological oriented talk. It will be more on the signal processing aspects of it. Some problems we typically encounter when we look at data with patients who have been implanted with these electrodes. And especially when you study them with MEG, which is magnetoencephalography. I will take you through the basics of them as I go through the talk. So even before we get into the other concepts, let me first talk about Parkinson's disease, deep brain stimulation, and magnetoencephalography. Typically, when we move, movement is part of a daily routine. I mean, movement is a very intricate organic part of human life. And volitional motor action is a combination of both active and passive motor paradigms. So even when you want to just extend your wrist, there are two things that happen in parallel. One is the active contraction of your flexors to move your wrist up, and there is also a passive relaxation of your flexors, right? So your extensors pull and your flexors give way, right? Otherwise, your movement won't happen. And this is broadly facilitated by the basal ganglia cortical loop. Many of you might be familiar with the BG cortical loop, but let me quickly go through the components. So the more important part of it is the last two, but striatum, which consists of the putamen and the caudate nucleus, and then we have the pallida, the globus pallidus interna and the externa, and we have the subthalamic nucleus, which is sort of the hero of this talk. And we also have substantia nigra, pars compactum, and reticularis. We will look at, there are functional uses of each of these. If you look at motor pathways, there are broadly three in kind. There has been a lot of churn in this understanding of motor pathways itself. And now we know that, now there is we don't know anything yet, but the strongest hypothesis points out towards three pathways: the direct, indirect, and the hyperdirect pathway. The direct pathway is a channel for active motor paradigms. It passes through striatum, GPI, back to the thalamus and the cortex. And then you have the indirect pathway, which goes from striatum. It is indirectly reaching the cortex via GP, STN, and then back to the thalamus and then the cortex. And indirect pathway is more a channel for inhibition of movement or passive motor paradigms, however you want to look at it. And then at least for the last 15-20 years, there has been a very strong notion of a hyperdirect pathway. Hyperdirect pathway, you can think about it as a copy of proposed movement, but it comes as a direct signal from the cortex directly to the STN. Now, this is interesting because this gives advanced information of what is going to happen in the near future. And broadly, this channel seems to be taking care of pre-inhibition of areas under the selected motor paradigm. So I'm assuming what is called the center surround model here, which was proposed by several people, including Atsushi Nambu. But there are various models of how these three pathways sort of interact and how they enable movement. As you can see, the direct and the indirect pathway have contrasting functional uses, and there needs to exist a balance between these two. And when there is an imbalance, it leads to movement disorders. Now, one such prominent movement disorder is Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease is typically due to the degeneration of dopaminergic neurons, the substantia nigra pars compacta, SNC. And the diagnosis typically happens when there is occurrence of motor symptoms. It is typically tremor, if not other issues like rigidity or akinetic symptoms, right? But this is at least several years, if not tens of years, from the origin of the disease. What we now know is that several biomarkers, which is now considered as biomarkers, but you can call it pre-motor or non-motor symptoms, start occurring several years before the actual motor symptoms start happening. So point zero that you see here is when the patient is visiting the hospital, right? But the disease might have been with the patient for several years before, if not tens of years before. And there are a lot of randomized controlled trials that are actually running to see if constipation or RBD. RBD is REM sleep behavioral disorder. So typically, when you are in REM sleep, you're dreaming, and I'm sort of caricaturing it, but broadly, when you dream, you don't act out your dreams. There is a strong inhibition of motor activity or actuating your dreams. But in case of RBD, patients actually literally start acting out their dreams. And that can happen anywhere between 7 to 10 years before the actual onset of motor symptoms. This is all interesting because then you can start looking at biomarkers which are 10 years ahead. And if you can pair it with, let's say, a future drug which can lead to a neuroprotective role, then there's a possibility that you can reduce the intensity, the progression pace of PD. But that aside, we will mostly focus on, my PhD work was mostly focused on sensory and motor problems. And most of the patients typically arrive with tremor, as I said, but there are also a substantial part of patients who don't have tremor. And diagnosis can be sometimes very tricky. Oh, I'm sorry. My mouse is jumping around. Yeah. So diagnosis of PD can be a bit tricky sometimes. It is typically done by what is called a drug challenge test. Patients are given a dopaminergic medication, levodopa, and then they see how the response to the medication is. If they respond positively to the medication, that is, if the symptoms subside, then there's a very high chance they have PD. This is the clinical drug challenge test that they do. The confirmatory, of course, is a DAT SPECT, dopamine transmitter SPECT image. But there have been cases where patients have been on PD medication for several years, and the DAT SPECT was anyway negative. And I've even heard cases of where DAT SPECT was negative up to 12 years. And the patients have been on PD treatment, and then they show up as a PD patient with a confirmatory test. So it's going to be pretty tricky to diagnose this. It is, some of the symptoms are very similar to other movement disorders also. Now, when we look at all of this, typically the patients are started with levodopa, which is the medication, and they are typically fine for up to 3 or 4 years. But we have to remember it's a neurodegenerative disorder, which means it is going to keep worsening. And 5 or 6 years later, they might be moved on to other classes of drugs. One of them is agonists. There are also several other classes of drugs that are prescribed to slight mid or advanced PD patients. And beyond a point, patients start having so-called off periods. Now, what are these off periods? Off periods are phases of the day when the medication just suddenly stops working. So they just stop working for no reason. And this becomes very problematic for the patient because they cannot have any prediction of when this off period would occur. It leads to a very drastic decrease in quality of life. It also leads to a lot of psychological issues. So these patients are then prescribed to go in for DBS surgery. There are some other factors, but some of these patients are prescribed and then they get into the deep brain stimulator implantation surgery. Now, deep brain stimulation is found to be very effective in treating motor symptoms and motor problems such as bradykinesia, rigidity, tremor, the triad of symptoms. But it also leads to some kind of mixed response when it comes to sensory symptoms, and the mechanisms of DBS are still unclear. There is, of course, a good question of why do we need to worry about mechanisms. It is necessary because the treatment is leading to side effects, and if we have to understand why the side effects occur, and if we want to titrate the treatment well in a patient-specific manner, you have to understand the mechanisms of DBS. And this is where the whole electrophysiological battery comes into play, because now we have to try and understand how DBS works, how DBS is affecting the functioning of the brain, especially the basal ganglia cortical motor cortical system. And this is where the challenges come into play. We will look at it one by one. So before we go there, if we just focus on where DBS is implanted in PD, it is typically implanted in either the subthalamic nucleus or globus pallidus interna, GPI, or STN. And then once the implantation is done, implantation is typically bilateral. So you have two leads in each hemisphere, one lead in each hemisphere. And then the wires are tunneled just behind the neck. And then the implantable pulse generator, IPG, is placed in the subclavicular space. Previously, it used to be that these surgeries were done on separate days. The implantation was done on one day, and then the pulse generator was placed on a separate day. Because once the leads are implanted, the leads are externalized. So they are sticking out of the scalp for up to 1 week. So they wait for the micro lesions to subside and the dyskinesias that occur when you puncture through STN to subside, and then they titrate. So they have to get the right setting, because as you can see here, there are at least 4 electrodes. This is the typical Medtronic St. Jude medical electrode system. Now Boston Scientific has 8. And you have to find the right depth to stimulate, and the right voltage to stimulate, and the right frequency. And this is a titration that can take hours or sometimes even days, right? And then once the titration is done, those settings are fed into the implantable generator, and it is placed inside the patient. This is typically how it works. But at least for the last 15-20 years, we can now communicate to this IPG wirelessly. So now the whole surgery happens in one shot, and then after a week's time, once the microlesion issues subside, the neurologist sits and titrates the measurement. So this is just an anecdotal thing. As you can see that both GPI and STN are part of the basal ganglia cortical circuit, and both of them seem to be efficacious in controlling motor symptoms. The center that I worked in, the implantation was typically done in STN. So most of our work was referred to DBS in STN. So how do we study the mechanism? So I spoke about mechanism. So then the question is, how do we study it? There are various ways to study it. One way to study it is using oscillations. Oscillations look like very abstract wiggly waves that just come out of nowhere, but it seems like these oscillations have a direct link to the behavior. And this is where we want to use the power of oscillations to understand what is happening in the brain. So this is actually a map of changes in local field potential power from STN when DBS is switched on and off. So you can see that DBS is switched on and switched off periodically. And here on this axis, you can call it the y-axis, you see frequency, x-axis you see time, and z is power. And you can see that in this so-called beta band, 12 to 40 hertz or 15 to 40 hertz, you can see a very nice decrease in the beta band power whenever the DBS is switched on, right? And this is interesting, but you could say this is just an epiphenomenon. Maybe it just happens. What is the use of it? They also could show that whenever there was a reduction in the beta power, there was an improvement in akinesia. which means the symptoms subside when the beta power decreases, right? So there seems to be some link between the behavior and the oscillations. And these oscillations, these behavioral links have also been found on some other oscillatory dynamics. So we know now that the gamma oscillations, which is anywhere above 40 hertz, it seems to be prokinetic, that we know. Beta oscillations seem to be antikinetic, and oscillations that are in the sub alpha or even in the lower alpha bands seem to be related to tremor. I mean, these things we know, and we can actually see an intricate link between behavior and oscillations, which means we can now study oscillations to understand what is happening, what might happen to the behavior. Now, there are various ways to study these oscillations. So here you see that the oscillations are studied at the debrained nuclei level. So these oscillations are from the subthalamic nucleus. We can also study oscillations from the cortex. There are a few advantages of it. One is that these kind of studies, where you want to study deep brain nuclei, typically happens only inside the OR, operation room. And it's very difficult to build good studies or quality studies there, because it's a very, very dynamic environment, and it is extremely difficult to hold sophisticated studies there, which is why we would want to do most of our studies ex situ. Even in ex situ, there are multiple options. You can do fMRI. You can also do, by the way, fMRI, there are issues because it could create metallic artifacts, but there are leads now that can allow for fMRI with DBS switched on also. So there have been 1 or 2 studies which have even been published on that. fMRI is one option. The other option is actually using electrophysiology, which is my field of interest. And for this purpose, we used MEG, magnetoencephalography. We all know about EEG. EEG is basically picking up changes in biopotentials on the brain scalp. Magnetoencephalography is trying to pick up the magnetic field of these electric potentials or electric fields. And there are basically, so whether it is EEG or MEG, it is going to typically pick up the EPSPs, the excitatory postsynaptic potentials of the pyramidal neurons. Now, pyramidal neurons have 2 very interesting properties. One is the geometrical structure of the pyramidal neuron. I mean, we know from Cahal's drawings that it is it's like a barrel shape. So it's very, very parallel in structure, and which means that the vectors can add up. It is an open field. It is not a closed field. So if it is a haphazard, then the electric fields might cancel out each other. But since they are rather parallelly arranged, it can lead to a superposition or even lumping up of these fields. The other aspect of it is the temporal synchronization. So several hundreds or thousands of neurons fire simultaneously, which then leads to a battery of charges which can also accumulate. So both the temporal synchronization and the geometrical structure lead to big enough potentials that we can measure from the cortical area. And MEG is also easy to deploy on disease cohorts. I will come to it slightly later. But if you look at it, the pyramidal neurons look something like this. You have the primary current, and then you have the magnetic induction. So this is the basic rule, Maxwell's rule. So when you have a current, you have a magnetic field around it. And with MEG, we are trying to measure this magnetic field. And if you, this is another explanatory figure to explain the primary current, the secondary currents, and how MEG can measure the electric potentials, the vectors. MEG has a slightly different way to measure the magnetic fields compared to EEG. EEG, you just put 2 electrodes on the scalp and you are picking up the potential difference. With MEG, because of the size of the potential, the energy that you're trying to pick up, and also through other interferences that might come in, the setup is slightly more complicated. It's a cryogenic device. So the pickup coil is actually dipped in liquid helium. So otherwise you need to be at superconducting states to pick up these signals. If we just quickly look at the sensing elements in an MEG, the sensing elements are of various kinds. So this is a simple coil. So this is called a magnetometer. Magnetometer is a simple, straightforward magnetic field sensing element. Whereas if you look at this is a gradient, right? You can see how it is differentially coupled. So this is what is called a planar gradiometer, which means you take the differential along this plane. And then what you see here is an axial gradiometer, which means you take the differential in the axial plane. If you look at the field distributions that are picked up by each of these sensing elements, so your magnetometer is going to pick up the basic magnetic field. It's a simple sensing element. The gradiometer is going to pick up fields that are directly under it, because fields that are slightly away from it will have equal induction on both these coils, which means they'll cancel out. Only fields which are very close to the center of it will be picked up. And as you can see, this is a planar gradiometer on, let's say, the x-axis, and you can call this the y-axis. So the axes are defined here. Right? And your axial gradiometer is going to be dBz by dz. So it will be on the z plane. But typically, so different MEG systems come with different combinations. The MEG systems that we used were typically using magnetometer and planar gradiometers. Now, the system is great and it is quite robust to pick up the signals. And it's also fairly comfortable compared to EEG for patient cohorts, because with EEG you cannot do long drawn out measurements. If you want to do a measurement over 3 hours or 2.5 hours, it can be pretty difficult because you're going to have a pretty heavy cap on your head. And then there is also the issue of impedances. So you have to keep correcting the impedances now and then. It's going to be a tough ask. With MEG, you don't have these issues. So what could go wrong? Artifacts. So typically what happens is we want to study patients when deep brain stimulation is switched on. That's very important for us. And we are now trying to measure magnetic fields of femtotesla. That's the level of energies we are looking at. And now if you put in a DBS source, which is typically going to be activated at a few milliamps, that is going to hugely corrupt the data. So there is no clear standard practice on how to deal with it. There are a few suggestions that have been built over the years. And there are also some tools with which we can actually do this filtering. One of the prominent tools that is used is MaxFilter or Maxwell filter. It uses spherical spectral harmonics. So, and then you can expand the space. I have a whole slide on this. Let me get to that. Yeah. So typically what happens is your DBS source is somewhere inside the head, and your MEG array, the array of sensors, are slightly outside the head, which is outside the scalp. What we can then do is we can try and separate the source of the signal between things that are within the shell. You can model the brain as a sphere or a shell, and then you can separate out components within and outside. So I will not go into the whole of the specifics because I have a lot of results to show. But typically, you want to separate out the components to the components that arise within the head, and that the component that arises outside the head. This has been fairly well validated through several experiments, but this is not a silver bullet. And moreover, how do you know if a particular signal, the source of that particular signal is still deep brain stimulator or the brain? It is still not very trivial to separate it out, which is why, so this is actually from one of our recordings. So we see the dotted lines are with the DBS, it should say DBS off. So this is actually wrong. Anyway, so the dotted lines are with DBS off and the solid lines are with DBS on. And you can see all over the left, the right parietal areas, and also the occipital areas, you have a peak. Right? Now, what is to say that is this a peak which is arising from the DBS artifact, or is it because of a brain signal? Right? And when I said max filter or TSSS as it's called, it has been validated before on some data. So this is a data with somatosensory evoked field, so which is you electrically stimulate the median nerve, and about 20 milliseconds later you can see evoked potentials in the brain. So this is a very, very standard way to probe the integrity of your ascending tract. And with deep brain stimulation on, you can see a lot of artifacts. And after filtering and applying TSSS, you can see that the so this vector here is the evoked potential, so the evoked field, right? And you can see the evoked field is far more clearer after TSSS. This is a very crude way of showing it, but is it so clean? One good thing about experiments like these is that you have a pre-stimulus and a post-stimulus part, which is, so you have a stimulus and you have some activity before the stimulus which you can use as a baseline. And then you have an active part which you can then use to normalize. Let me show you how it works. So you see here, so this is, let's say, so this is from the study that we did in Aarhus. We have patients who come in without medication through the night. They are only on DBS when we do one set of measurements. And then we switch off the DBS and they are on the washout phase. And then we do one more measurement. So we will not go into these results now. What is of interest to us is this picture here. So this is a time frequency representation of the oscillations that occur in the sensory motor area, somewhere in the parietal area, in the contralateral side. So we stimulated on the right hand, so you can see activations on the left side. So that's the simple thing that we need to understand here. So you can see that the stimulus is provided at 0.0 milliseconds, but we also have some pre-stimulus interval, right? And then what we typically do is we take this pre-stimulus interval and then we normalize it with the post-stimulus period. Okay, so let's say if you have some artifacts here, that will get cancelled out. That's the main advantage of having a pre-stimulus or a baseline in your study. But there are also studies without a baseline. So what do you do? There are a lot of studies which do resting state, which work on resting state data, for example. Then how do you deal with such kind of data? It becomes pretty tricky. When we started thinking about this, it was actually during my PhD defense. Jyrki Mäkelä, who is a professor at the Helsinki hospital, suggested that we could do what is called a Mellon experiment. This is pretty interesting, which is the context of the whole talk today. What we did was, this has been done before. This is not an innovation by us, but this has not been done in MEG with the same electrode and IPG combination, which is why we are able to now say what kind of artifacts we are actually seeing. So what we did was we took a lemon and we pushed in 2 DBS electrodes, and you can also see the IPG. And these were placed inside the MEG scanner, and we started recording. And we recorded the data. This was done by Andreas Heulund, who was my former postdoc. The data was recorded with various DBS settings, different voltages, different pulse widths, different frequencies, and so on. And then we wanted to look at and capture the spectral profile of what happens because of these artifacts. Now, because it's a watermelon, you can be sure that none of it is from the brain, right? It is just the noise. What you see is going to be the noise floor and the artifacts that are arising due to DBS. So the first question we wanted to ask was, does TSSS, which is max filter, which is the standard routine that is used while looking at data like this, does it help? So what you see here is raw data with DBS of 0 volts, 3 volts, and 5 volts. and then data, the same raw data that has been processed through TSSS, max filter. And it is interesting. Some things we would immediately recognize: power line noise. This is something we anyway know will happen. And then there is the DBS artifact. The stimulation was at 130 hertz. So we have a nice DBS artifact peak. And then we also found something like an interference peak, something somewhere around 80 hertz, just possibly the destructive interference between power line 50 hertz and then the 130 hertz. And then we also had a subharmonic. You can see that with 0 volts, there is no peak here, but with 3 volts and 5 volts, you can see a peak here, which means it's some kind of a subharmonic of the DBS artifact. And we found something else. Now, this is not in the raw data, but it only occurs with the TSSS. Right? So it looks like TSSS is messing up and adding some new components which are not even there to start with. And if you see, these two are very important because this DBS subharmonic, which is around 20 hertz, lies squarely in the middle of a very important frequency component, generally in neuroscience and especially in Parkinson's disease, which is beta band. And this artifacted peak, the unknown TSS peak, it seems to be lying in the alpha band. These two are bands which are typically studied across neuroscience and especially in PD as well. So then it started, this is interesting because this has not been shown before. We are still trying to explore where this is coming from. We have a brief idea, but we have not yet completely solved this issue. And this is actually interesting because we may have to reevaluate several results that have been published. And the common thing that is typically said is that, so before that I have to explain what is monopolar and bipolar stimulation. So monopolar stimulation is when you stimulate between the IPG and the lead, whereas bipolar is when you stimulate between 2 leads. So I told you there are 4 leads that can be used to stimulate in each electrode. Bipolar stimulation, because you're stimulating between 2 leads which are very close to each other, the noise signature of it is quite low. Whereas monopolar, because the closing of the circuit happens with the IPG, which is sitting several centimeters away from the actual position of the DBS electrode, you can obviously imagine that the noise component will be very high. And that is what we show here actually. We can show that monopolar stimulation is creating a larger artifact compared to the bipolar stimulation with the same stimulation settings. And it's also interesting to see that the 50 hertz peak is not really altered. You can see that is more or less pretty similar. Now, if we look at the topographical representation of how these artifacts are looking like, you can see that the DBS artifact creates an interesting topographical pattern, and the 20 hertz subharmonic has a very similar pattern. That's interesting. And if we look at the top 4 plots, which is typically what is studied in neuroscience, you can see that the alpha, low gamma, and high gamma topographical plots don't really match with the DBS artifact or the subharmonic, whereas the beta, which actually has the subharmonic peak as well, right? Because it goes from 13 to 30, that has a topographical representation which is very similar to the beta peak. Right? So these are interesting because now it is giving us tools with which we can probe whether the signal that we have got is actually an artifact or not. And we also looked at how the artifacts are distributed in various frequency bands. So you have the alpha, beta, low gamma, and the high gamma band. These are typical bands that we use. And we can see that the artifact is quite strong in the parietal and the temporal areas. And especially the artifact is stronger on the left-hand side, the left hemisphere. It is probably because that is where the wires were going out. The wires were taken, I think, through the left-hand side to be connected to the watermelon, but we are not sure about this part of the story yet. We are still reconfirming with the data that we have already. And you can also see that there is quite a difference between the artifact on the left versus the right hemisphere, probably because of the wires. So this is another interesting result to note. So these results are interesting because we are now going to use these to build a pipeline. So I'll show you in the next few slides. And you can also see that the beta, the power at the beta, so these are arbitrary units, normalized arbitrary units. So you can see the beta power, it's very, very high compared to the others. It is because it subsets the subharmonic peak. And if you start correlating the power, the voltage, dBs voltage versus the power that we see in each of these, we can quickly start seeing that 20 hertz peak, it increases with increasing voltage. That's a no-brainer. But it's good to know and good to have it on paper, because these are things that you can hypothesize, but nobody really knows how it pans out when you actually record things. So that's the main intention of the study, to confirm a lot of let's say myths and stories. And you can also see beta band, which subsets our 20 hertz subharmonic, also is very much correlated with the dBs voltage. And the high gamma, which subsets the interference peak that we talked about, that also has a high correlation with the dBs voltage. Now, I'll skip this normalization part because I think I'm getting close to the last 10 minutes of my talk. We also looked at normalization, and we could show that the normalization that is typically used in most papers doesn't work. It actually does more bad than good. So that's the bottom line of that story, but I'll skip that part. So based on the results that we can see now, we have to be careful when we use max filter on dBs data. So you have to tread cautiously. That's the first takeaway. The second takeaway is that you could use the contralateral region. Let's say I'm asking somebody to make a fist and do repetitive motions on the right hand. So we are looking at the left hemisphere typically. We could use the right hemisphere as a sham area, or the occipital region as a sham area. And if we are not able to see the same spectral changes in the sham area, then we can be more or less sure that it is not an artifact. So that's something we can use now. So because of the study, we can see that the contralateral region is not equally affected. And you can also see that the dBs subharmonics are correlated with the dBs voltages. So this can be one more check that can be used. But we have to be also clear that some of these results might be MEC scanner specific, or it can be specific to the dBs stimulator that you use. So what we also would recommend is that people who want to do a dBs based experiment, especially without a baseline, they should run this MELAN experiment on their own MEC scanner. It is a very important thing that it's not very expensive to do. It's a very quick study. You can do it within a few hours, and you should be able to generate these spectral representations very soon. That will give you a very good idea of where the noise sources mostly can be. So these are the takeaways, and with these we can build a short pipeline that can be used to say whether the peak is the spectral information that we see is artifacted or it is not artifacted, or it's just actually brain seeping. So this is actually a vexed topic. So we explored it in a very we used non-human specimen here, which is watermelon. And so that concludes this part of the talk. I will quickly go through one other aspect of work that we do, which is stroke. Stroke, we wanted to look at gamified stroke rehabilitation, especially looking at a neuromechanical motivation for it. The story doesn't start with us. It starts with a company called BABL, which is incubated in IIT Hyderabad under CFHE. So what they built was a bimanual rehabilitation system with a game overlay. So patients can play games when they want to rehabilitate. This is a very well-known scenario. There are several other ways of doing this. There is also VR. Several people have used it. I'm pretty sure it's also being used in IIT Madras. Stroke, to quickly run through, it is typically ischemic in nature, and much of the recovery happens within the first few days. And the earlier you start with the recovery, the better it is for the patient. So these are very well known. But what is also interesting is that, especially in humans compared to animal models, it is not just a matter of dexterity or movement initiation and so on, but it is more the synergy between movements. In humans, at least, because of the various degrees of motions we have, there is a lot of synergy that is required to initiate movements, and some of the movements uh, are not underdetermined. Actually, there are only very few ways in which you can perform some movements, and it is very difficult for a patient to perform these movements, by compensating through other means, through other muscles and so on. And this actually puts emphasis back on not reading too much into the animal model results, because there is a place at which animal models will stop telling us information on how humans might rehabilitate. This is a very interesting thing that has been happening over the last 3-4 years that we can observe from literature. Currently, the kind of treatment for stroke management is completely arbitrary, and the kind of prognosis is that you can do. It's very difficult to do prognosis now. So this is where we wanted to come in. We wanted to then say, can we use data? Can we actually record data from humans while they play these games? And can we try and understand how healthy subjects respond to these games, how the muscles of the healthy subjects respond to these games? Once we know that, we can then go ahead and try to understand how stroke patients respond to this. And then with these, we want to then see if we can build some kind of a neuromechanical motivation to try and see if we can nudge the patient towards better synergy. That's a broad bottom line of this study, which we want to continue. As part of this particular study, we asked healthy subjects, 15 of our volunteers, healthy volunteers, who was in the university going age group, to do 3 tasks. So one was point-to-point octane. So this is a very standard task. So you go from center up, center down, and then you trace, right? So this is randomized in various. So you will go up and then down, left, bottom, right, and so on. It's randomized within these 8 directions. They also try to do a point-to-point circle, clockwise and anti-clockwise, and then random reach, right? And you can imagine this is actually driven inside a game. So they are actually, I think, going to spot a mosquito or something like that. The game is to spot a mosquito, if I'm right. So the mosquito pops up in different places, which is driving them towards a particular pattern. And we also made the subjects perform this at 2 inclinations. So one was at 0 and the other was at 30 degrees. What we told, so when we looked at the data, we felt both the point-to-point circle and octane are simple reach, because it's going to be a very linear reach, more or less, whereas the random is going to be slightly more complex. So that's why we split the data. We called point-to-point octane and point-to-point circle to be simple task, whereas we call the point-to-point random as a complex task. And to start with, we basically looked at 2 things. One, intermuscular coherence between the various muscles. So we had sensors in the flexor components, bicep, tricep, and then the deltoid. And then we wanted to see how flexors and extensors synergically operate when they move through the space. We have not completely analyzed this data, but what we can see already, so this was recently shown in a conference at SPCOM, actually, in IISc, which happened a few months back under the COVID dark cloud. What we could immediately see is that the muscle output, or the RMS of the EMG, it is increased with a complex task. Now, this is counterintuitive, actually, because you would assume that RMS would not increase, synergy would increase, but that didn't happen. The synergy or the intermuscular coherence was not altered, whereas the muscular input actually increased. On the flip side, you would assume that when you want to push something up, when you want to work on an elevated plane, you might need more firing or more muscular output to maintain position. But that was not the case. Actually, muscular output was not very different, whereas intermuscular coherence was hugely affected. What we think is happening is, to compensate for the increased load, the muscles are not resorting to increased firing, they are resorting to increased synergy. At least this is what we see in healthy subjects. We are now curious to see what will happen in patients, which is again being halted due to COVID. So hopefully in the near future we can actually do these measurements on patients as well, and then that will give us a good framework to understand how patients are compensating and how this compensation changes over time when they rehabilitate. So this is the gross muscular output and how output changes with respect to the direction. So I'm not going to these. We could also look at how synergies or IMC changes, the intermuscular coherence between muscles changes. You can typically see that there is an increased coherence between the anti-gravity muscles, especially the triceps, biceps, and so on. So the top half is with a 30-degree inclination, and the bottom half is with a 0-degree inclination. We did not see a significant difference, but we can see patterns emerging. But we need to study this data more before we can make comments on that. So broadly, the study is giving us some kind of a basis for designing exercise paradigms, but we have to wait until we do this experiment on stroke patients. That will actually give us more information. We have not looked at the mechanical parameters yet, but the initial look suggests that there seems to be some relation between the mechanical parameters, which is velocity, joint angle changes, and so on. That is related to synergy, IMC, and the gross muscular output. We think these can also be used for prescription and assessment. So you can also think about prescribing exercise, getting data on how the exercise was performed, and that can be used to perform assessments on the patients. And this can actually give us a framework of doing assessments remotely. It can give us a framework of doing assessments in a more metric-based, objective manner. And that's what we want to do next up. We want to actually see if we can build this platform that can be shipped out with the device sometime in the near future. So that about concludes my talk. Thanks to my lab members. So much of the studies were done by Suranjita and two interns in my lab, Pradeep and then Chandra. So thanks a lot, and special acknowledgements to Andreas, who worked on the watermelon data. So he was the one who actually acquired the data for us. So thanks to Andreas for that. And I'm open for questions.
Yeah, so thanks a lot, Dr. Kaushik. It's an excellent talk. I have a very small question, a clarification. So in one of your early slides, you talked about prokinetic, antikinetic, and tremor.
Yeah.
Right, oscillations. Can you just clarify that a little bit? It sounds very interesting. That,
Yeah. So, so let me start with prokinetic, for example. This picture is from 2005, but it's quite prophetic because until about 2017, we got a slew of papers, at least between 2012 to 17, which actually went into each of these. Let's take, for example, the prokinetic signals. Right? So there is a paper from the Philip Starr group in 2015, and they actually published a slew of papers. It's like 6 or 7 papers, one after the other. So they have a very interesting setup. I don't have the diagrams for it, but maybe I can quickly even draw it and show. Let me try and draw it. It's not very difficult to do that.
So these authors, I'm not able to read. Is it Schluchzer and Gross?
Yeah, it's Schnitzler and Gross, 2005.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so I might have to stop the presentation for a moment before I draw it. Or maybe I'll just try to explain it verbally. So what Philip Starr group did was, So you have the cortex, you have the basal ganglia, and let's say in basal ganglia you have your stimulator at the STN, right? And in the cortex they placed a ECOG grid, electrocardiogram grid, which can measure what is happening in the M1 and S1, and they were stimulating. So this is the setup that they had, and they got some very interesting data. For example, one of the things that they could show is that whenever movement happens, so this is actually well known. Whenever movement happens, there is an increase in gamma activity in the cortex. This is well known actually. And before movement, there is a suppression of so the ERD, ERS, so event-related desynchronization. So there is a decrease in beta when the movement is initiated, and there is a rebound of beta when the movement is done. But when the movement is actually happening, there is an increase in gamma activity. So this result, this is actually even true in healthy subjects. This result comes from two papers from Crone, C-R-O-N-E et al. To 1998, if I'm right. So they published a pair of papers. So the paper comes with the same title with Roman number 1 and 2. So it's a clear pair of papers. So there they actually put ECOG grids on the health cortex of, I think, epileptic patients to show this the change of oscillations when you move before movement, during movement, and after movement. So prokinetic being so gamma being prokinetic is well known, and it has also been shown in Parkinson's disease. When you look at antikinetic, so this is actually one example of looking at antikinetic behavior, wherein reduction in beta leads to an improvement in symptoms, antikinetic symptoms, which means typically this was a intraoperative study, which means they were doing this. So finger tapping, this is a standard test that is done on PD patients. So they were able to see that the patients were able to finger tap better, because this has several aspects, right? So it's easy for us, but when you break this action up, there are several things that are happening. You have to initiate it, and then you have to perform it, and then you have to maintain pace. This is extremely complicated, and you will understand the worth of it when you actually look at a PD patient trying to do it, because they will be like this for several seconds sometimes, because for them they have initiated the movement, but the motor system has not responded to it. They're still waiting for the tap to happen, right? And then it is not very well timed. They will do this, and then they will start, clenching. It's amazing to see how motor system responds when the systems are not, working well enough. So this is well known. Antikinetic. Tremor-related oscillations, mainly it comes from papers from Lars Timmermann. So he is one of the very few people who works on electrophysiology and tremor, and they could see that there is correlation, there is coherence between the flexor extensor interplay. So because it's a pill roll tremor, as it's called, the tremor is not like this. It's a pill roll tremor, which means there is some kind of a seesaw between the flexor extensor components, and it has been shown that it is more dominant in the sub-alpha bands. Around 4 to 8 hertz is where most of the synergy happens between the cortex and the muscles. So if you want literature on that, it is typically Lars Timmermann. The reason why nobody works on tremor is because it's very difficult to capture data. Because once the tremor starts, everything is shaking, because the patient is also shaking, and this leads to corruption of your data. It's very difficult to handle data like that. This is a very specialized kind of. It needs a very good synergy between the clinical and the experimental team to do works like that. It's actually a work of art, in fact. There are also studies which in fact try to use TES, transcranial electrical stimulation, in the beta range, TACS to be specific, and they could show it is antikinetic. I think they show behavioral changes, like the stroke length when they are writing. If I'm right, it is actually from the Peter Brown group. But these are papers I can circulate. It's not a. It's all on my Mendeley. It shouldn't take much time to circulate them. Each of these comes from very long set of studies from very different labs. Antikinetic, beta and antikinetic typically comes from Peter Brown's group. Tremor related comes from Lars Timmermans group. Prokinetic comes from various groups, including Corley D. Hempton and there are also a set of papers around 2015 to 17, which were in a similar setup from the Philip Starr group in the University of California. So he's actually a neurosurgeon who does a lot of very interesting intraoperative electrophysiology work. So just to say that I can circulate these papers if you would like. What we know is that this is not epiphenomenon. It doesn't look like epiphenomenon. There seems to be some very strong relation between behavior and these oscillations. There are also some other later studies. In fact, very recently, I think I even sent a paper that talks about the entropy in STN.
Yeah.
So this might actually be very interesting to you, Professor Singh, because we say familiarity breeds contempt, right? So when you have too much of regular repetitive signals, maybe it shuts off the new information channels completely. And this is in itself pathological.
So similar to epilepsy, also same problem.
Yeah.
Too much regular activity is a sign of pathology, right?
Exactly.
Regularity of oscillation.
Exactly. I mean, this is actually pervading the whole system, right? Even when you have a reduction in HRV, heart rate variability, that's shown to be a sign of problem, right? So, in fact, there was also a paper from a theoretical physics paper from Peter Tass, who talked about something called coordinated reset. For a very long time, we wanted to try it during my time in Germany, but we never got around to it because the setup you need to do it, you have to do it intraoperatively because we did not have the ways and means to measure from the electrode in real time. That was not possible then, 10 years back, but now it is possible. Now Medtronic has a new generator which can actually real-time stream signals out. So now it's actually possible to do experiment with things like coordinated reset, where Peter Tass talks about injecting the right amount of noise through spiking patterns directly in the STN and not stimulating at 130 Hertz, which is pretty interesting actually. It is interesting at several levels, mainly because it also widens the therapeutic window. For now, they only have a very small bandwidth, so they can titrate between 120 to 150 Hertz and then between 2 to 5 volts. That's it. Beyond this is the window they have. But if you start doing things like coordinated reset, it's beautiful because then you have a far wider window to titrate with.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Is there any other questions? Anybody?
Yeah, maybe I have one question, sir.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. It was very nice. Actually, now what if I understand correctly, the DBS, when we are doing a DBS treatment, first we do an electrophysiological study, analyze what all the areas are impacted and what is that pathological oscillations that is observed in that region of interest, and then design the pulse generator, set the amplitude and frequency accordingly, and basically what we are doing is that nullify the pathological activity that is happening in the STN-GP region. So and we are also linking the behavior to the oscillations. So now different functional activities and also different pathologies show different kinds of symptoms and oscillatory behavior, like the resting tremor, or if we are moving, so that even in the pathology condition that frequency band will be different in the STN. So how exactly, what all parameters do we consider while planning what type of pulse generator to use? And does during the disease progression, this parameters need to be updated? And because it is not very feasible to update it easily, so and how long does it last, that DBS effect? What? Yeah.
Okay, Sandeep, I have to answer. There are several questions, so let me answer them one by one. So,
okay.
How is the implantation done? So the implantation procedure has nothing to do with oscillations. Unlike
Right.
epilepsy, for example. Epilepsy, now there are protocols in which you can use EEG or MEG or a combination of EEG, MEG, do source localization to figure out where the epileptic focus is, and then the surgery is done. So none of that is done in the case of Parkinson's disease. Okay. So the target is straightforward. So if the patients have, so this is the clinical pathway. Okay. So if the patients have the off periods, it means the medication is not efficacious for them anymore. Okay, because it's a progressive disorder. So they are recommended for DBS, and then they undergo this drug challenge test once more, and if they are positive for that, and then they don't have other psychological disorders, depression, etc., then they are recommended for surgery. And the placement of the electrode is straightforward. Okay, the titration that you talked about, the exact pulse width and the parameters and so on, the generator itself is the same, the hardware is the same, but what pulse width, what frequency, what amplitude, it depends on a number of factors, including the accuracy of placement of the electrode. Okay, because you can imagine in a 3D space, it is barely a few, 3 or 4 millimeters by 6 millimeters. You can imagine a very small, it's like a grain, slightly, 3-4 times the grain of rice, right? It's a few millimeters by few millimeters. That's it. The STN, right?
Yes.
So, so the titration is going to make sure that you actually stimulate this nucleus. Okay.
Right. Yes.
And typically the titration is done by looking at the motor symptom elevation, but at the same time, the patients can also feel certain side effects. So if I can just pull up, so you can see that, 1 second. So you can see that you put it somewhere here, and then right in the middle is the internal capsule. You see, this is STN, and this is the internal capsule. Okay. And the internal capsule, so if you stimulate slightly farther away from it, you'll start creating tingling sensations and so on, right? You start creating sensory problems for the patient. Okay. And if you stimulate too deep, that leads to autonomic function. So you cannot control the bladder and things like that. There are several issues here. Right? The titration is mainly focused on optimal motor symptom elevation, along with the fact that there should be no other side effects to it. This is how the titration is done. Right? Oscillations, we look at it post fact. Okay, we look at oscillations as a phenomenon to understand what is happening. But there are proposals of how even oscillations can be used, how you can use the beta oscillations for implantation. So Hagai Bergman's group in Israel, they have done a lot of work on this. We have also discussed this. I have discussed this with Professor Srinivas Chakravarti quite a bit. They have done a lot of work on, Zvi Israel is the neurosurgeon who actually, they did a lot of studies on how you can use the beta oscillations to implant it in the right place. They came up with this terminology called DLOR, dorsolateral oscillatory region. So they said you cannot implant anywhere in the STN. STN is already a small space, but they said you cannot implant anywhere in the STN. You have to implant it in a certain place in the STN, which is dorsal and lateral. So you can think about STN, which is pointing like this. So you have to be on the crown. That is what they said, right? And they even built, systems. In fact, they were one of the main research arms for Alpha Omega systems. And Alpha Omega is now bought out by Medtronic, I think, but they are a very, very potent intraoperative neuromonitoring system. So some of it, oscillations are used even for implantations, but not in a very huge manner as it is. It's not a standardized thing. Some centers use it, some centers don't.
Okay.
Okay, I think in the reasons of time, so if anybody has more questions, please contact Dr. Kaushik. Is very helpful.
Yeah.
Right. If there are no more questions, I think we'll conclude the talk today. And again, once more, I'd like to thank Dr. Kaushik for the excellent talk. And we'll keep interacting. And there's a lot I think we can learn from you. We'll keep in touch.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Kaushik.
Yeah. Bye.
And thanks for everybody for joining us. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks to everyone for listening in. Yeah. Thank you.